I can still picture the exact moment when my husband, in that usual indifferent tone of his, casually mentioned that his boss, Mr. Donovan, would be joining us for dinner. It was just another evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I was in the middle of setting the table, carefully arranging the plates, when he dropped it on me like it was nothing. "Oh, by the way, babe, Donovan's coming over tonight," he said, as if he were telling me we were out of milk. I froze. The glass in my hand nearly slipped from my fingers as those words sank in. Mr. Donovan. Just hearing his name sent an uneasy jolt through me, a discomfort I couldn't quite shake. I had never met the man in person, but I didn't have to. His reputation spoke for itself. I had heard plenty about him, and none of it was particularly reassuring. He was powerful, influential, the kind of man who never took no for an answer. Ruthless in business. A master at bending people to his will with just a few well-placed words. I forced a smile, trying to mask the growing knot in my stomach, and continued adjusting the silverware. "Oh, that's unexpected," I said, but even to my own ears, my voice lacked the enthusiasm I was hoping for. My husband, ever so nonchalant, just shrugged. "Yeah," he insisted. "He doesn't do home visits often, so I figured it must be something important." Then, with that same careless ease, he added, "But he didn't ask me, he told me." To him, this was just another dinner. Nothing unusual. But instead of reassuring me, his words only deepened my unease. Something about this whole situation felt off. I couldn't explain why, but the feeling gnawed at me, an instinctive warning I tried to dismiss. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe Mr. Donovan was just another overworked executive looking to socialize outside of the office for once. Maybe he just wanted to establish some kind of personal connection. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, that uneasy feeling stayed with me, tightening its grip with every passing minute. And then, just as I was taking a deep breath, trying to steady myself, I heard it, the knock at the door. Sharp, firm. A sound that carried weight, like a signal that something was about to change. My husband, suddenly more enthusiastic than I'd seen him all evening, practically beamed. That must be him. And then, there he was. The moment I laid eyes on Mr. Donovan standing in my doorway, I still had no idea just how much of an impact he would have on me. He was taller than I'd imagined, with broad shoulders that made him seem even more imposing. He was dressed impeccably, a sleek black suit that hugged his frame just a little too perfectly, like it had been tailored not for comfort but for dominance. His dark eyes locked onto mine the second he stepped inside, sharp and assessing, as though he were measuring me in ways I couldn't quite grasp. Then, with what seemed like calculated precision, he smiled. A slow, deliberate curve of his lips, like he already knew something about me that even I hadn't figured out yet. I instinctively extended my hand, doing my best to maintain a polite facade despite the growing unease creeping up my spine. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Donovan," I said, though my voice betrayed the slightest tremor. His handshake was firm, too firm. Not just a greeting, but a reminder. A deliberate show of strength, as if to make sure I felt it. The kind of handshake that lingered long after it ended. "Please," he said smoothly, his voice rich and confident, carrying an undeniable authority. "Call me Richard." A lump formed in my throat as an involuntary shiver ran down my spine. There was something about the way he spoke, the way his words lingered in the air, that made my skin prickle with unease. My husband, of course, was completely oblivious. He chuckled like everything was perfectly normal. "Come on in, Donovan, make yourself at home," he said, clearly eager to get to whatever business they had to discuss. No, Richard stepped further into the house, his gaze sweeping over the room, taking everything in. But even as his eyes moved, they always found their way back to me. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but I felt it. The dinner started off innocently enough, just the usual talk of business, upcoming deals, stock markets, and whatever else fueled their world. My husband and Richard fell into conversation effortlessly, their words flowing back and forth while I quietly picked at my food, trying my best to tune out the financial jargon. But then, I started to notice it. His gaze. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was being paranoid. But every time I glanced up, there he was, Richard's eyes fixed on me. Watching. Unwavering. Studying me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore the weight of his attention, but it never let up. This wasn't just polite eye contact. This wasn't someone glancing my way out of mere courtesy. No. This was different. This was the way a predator watches its prey. Patient. Calculating. Waiting for just the right moment to make its move. My fingers tightened around my fork as another wave of unease washed over me. The conversation around the table continued, but I felt disconnected from it, like I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere I didn't want to be. I tried to push the feeling away, to tell myself I was imagining things. And then, just when I thought I might be able to shake it, Richard leaned back in his chair with that same effortless, self-assured ease and asked a question that made my entire body go rigid. "So," he said, his voice smooth, almost too casual, "how did you two meet?" My husband, always eager to tell the story, practically lit up. "Oh, it's a funny one," he said, his grin widening as he launched into the familiar tale. I forced a small smile, doing my best to mask my unease as he recounted the details, how we'd met at a coffee shop, how I'd accidentally spilled my drink on his shirt, how he jokingly told me I owed him a date to make up for it. It was a light-hearted story, one I had heard and told 100 times before. But as my husband laughed, lost in the memory, I could still feel Richard's gaze pressing down on me. A silent, constant weight that refused to let up. And then, out of nowhere, he asked a question that sent a slow, creeping chill through me. "Before you met your husband," he said, tilting his head slightly, the corners of his lips tugging into a smirk, "what kind of man were you into?" The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. The room fell silent. And in that moment, I knew, whatever this was, it was only just beginning. And just like that, the air in the room turned ice cold. It wasn't just an odd question, it was personal, invasive, the kind of thing that made my skin crawl. My husband, ever the optimist, let out an awkward chuckle, clearly sensing the tension but trying to brush it off. "Come on, Donovan, that's a weird question," he said, forcing a lightness into his voice. An attempt to smooth things over. But Richard didn't even glance at him. He just kept his eyes locked on me. I forced a tight, polite laugh, hoping to push past the moment, to ignore the unsettling discomfort twisting in my gut. "I don't think that's relevant," I said, my tone a little sharper than I intended. Richard's smirk only deepened. His eyes gleamed with something I couldn't quite place. "Everything is relevant," he murmured, almost to himself, like the words carried some hidden weight. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I dropped my gaze to my plate, suddenly losing my appetite. My husband, still blissfully unaware of the shift in atmosphere, laughed awkwardly and steered the conversation to safer ground. But it was too late. The mood had already changed. The air felt heavier, thick with something unspoken. And no matter how much I tried to push it away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. After dinner, I busied myself with cleaning up, desperate for space. I needed a moment to breathe, to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest like a weight. But even as I stood at the sink, rinsing dishes, I felt it again. That presence. I turned my head slightly. Richard was leaning against the doorway, watching me. My grip tightened around the plate in my hands, forcing myself to stay composed. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. He smiled, a slow, calculated expression that sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "You're good at this," he said. I frowned. "At what?" His smirk deepened as he stepped forward, playing the perfect wife. I went completely still. His voice was lower now, meant only for me. "Smiling when you have to. Laughing when it's expected. Pretending not to notice when a man watches you for too long." The water was still running. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached to turn it off. "I don't know what you're talking about." His expression didn't change. "Oh, but you do." He took another step closer. Close enough that I could catch the faintest trace of his cologne, dark, expensive, suffocating. "Your husband doesn't notice, does he?" he murmured. My breath hitched. I turned sharply, my pulse hammering in my ears. "I think you should go back to the living room." Silence. Then, that same unnerving smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. Without another word, he turned and walked away, as if nothing had happened. I stood there gripping the counter, my breathing uneven. He hadn't touched me. He hadn't said anything explicitly threatening. But somehow, I felt like he had. "Everything okay in there?" My husband's voice called from the patio, snapping me back to reality. I opened my mouth, chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. I could tell him. I should tell him. But before I could say a word, Richard turned back toward me. And then, I saw it. The warning in his eyes. Silent, unspoken, but clear as day. My blood ran cold, because I knew exactly what he was telling me. If I said anything now, he would twist it. Make it seem like I had misunderstood. Or worse, like I had invited it. The risk was too great. So instead, I swallowed the fear rising in my throat, took a deep breath, and forced my voice to stay steady. Yeah, I called back. Everything's fine. My husband re-entered the room, completely oblivious. He smiled at Richard. Hope she wasn't boring you too much. Richard chuckled. On the contrary, he said smoothly. She's fascinating. I forced myself not to react. My husband laughed. See? I told you she's great. Richard turned to me then, his gaze lingering just a little too long. Yes, he murmured. She is. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I let out a slow, shaky breath. I needed to get away. To put some distance between myself and the man who had spent the entire night pushing the boundaries of normal conversation. The dinner. The lingering stares. The way his words carried a weight that felt dangerous. It was all too much. But still, I couldn't shake the cold sensation running down my spine. I turned on the faucet, watching the water rush over the dishes, trying to ground myself. Breathe. It's just one dinner. He'll leave soon. That's what I told myself. Until I heard it. Soft footsteps behind me. I froze. My hands gripped the edge of the sink. For a fleeting second, I thought, maybe it's my husband. Maybe he had finally noticed something was off. Maybe he was coming to check on me. Maybe I had imagined everything about Richard. Maybe I was just overreacting. Then I turned. And every single ounce of hope vanished. Richard stood there, leaning against the doorway. His presence filled the space, making the kitchen feel impossibly small. My jaw clenched. Do you need something? That same slow, knowing smile. No, he murmured. Just admiring the view. My breath hitched. There was nothing casual about the way he said that. I grabbed a towel, drying my hands quickly. You should head back to the living room. He didn't move. Your husband is busy, he finished for me, stepping forward. I swallowed hard. He was blocking the only exit. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the slight dampness of sweat forming on my palms. I forced a small, polite laugh. You're making me nervous standing there like that. He tilted his head, studying me. Am I? I nodded, gripping the towel tighter. Yes, you are. But instead of stepping away, he moved closer. The kitchen lights flickered slightly, casting sharp shadows over his features. His eyes weren't just looking at me. They were searching me. For weakness. For permission. For something I wasn't willing to give. I took a step back, but my hip hit the counter. No more room. He noticed. The corner of his lips lifted. You're different than I expected, he murmured, his voice impossibly smooth. I swallowed hard. Expected? You carry yourself a certain way, he said, taking another step forward. Like a woman who knows she deserves more. I turned my face away, the scent of his cologne thick and suffocating. Please step back. He reached out. And before I could stop him, his fingers brushed against a strand of my hair. I flinched, not dramatically, but enough. And he noticed. He didn't pull away. Instead, he took his time, slowly twisting the strand between his fingers before finally letting it slip back against my shoulder. My mouth went dry. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get a full breath. The air in the kitchen was thick, pressing down on me, suffocating. Don't do that, I whispered. His lips curved slightly, as if my reaction amused him. Do what? I forced myself to move, to push past him, to create space. But he shifted just enough to block my path again. I swallowed hard. Let me go. My voice was firmer now. He studied me, his dark eyes flicking over my face, searching. For what, I didn't know. Then finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stepped back. But he didn't stop looking at me. Not for 1 second. I wanted him gone. I wanted to run upstairs, lock the bedroom door, and put as much distance between us as possible. But I couldn't move. Not yet. Not until I was sure he wouldn't follow me. I turned my back on him, pretending to focus on stacking the plates. A low chuckle rumbled from his throat. Then he said something that made every single hair on my body stand on end. You don't have to pretend around me. I froze. My hands gripped the edge of the counter. Slowly, I turned to face him. Excuse me? His smirk widened. I see it, he murmured, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. I forced myself to stay still. See what? He stepped closer, though this time, he didn't touch me. He didn't have to. His words alone sent an icy shiver down my spine. The way your breath catches. I went rigid. His voice dropped lower. The way you hesitate when I get close. My stomach twisted painfully. His head tilted slightly, like he was piecing together a puzzle. You might act like you don't want this, he murmured. My pulse pounded so hard in my ears I could barely hear anything else. But your body tells a different story. Something inside me snapped. I shoved past him, my entire body trembling with rage, with fear, with something I didn't even have words for. This time, he let me go. But I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my back as I stormed out of the kitchen. I stepped into the living room, my breath shaky, my hands clenched into fists. My husband was still outside, completely oblivious, laughing at something on his phone. A wave of panic rose in my chest. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to scream. But I didn't. Because I knew, the second I opened my mouth, Richard would twist it. He'd make it sound innocent, like I'd overreacted. And if I couldn't prove anything, would my husband even believe me? A few moments later, Richard strolled back into the living room. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just cornered me in my own kitchen. With an easy, effortless smile, he turned to my husband. "This was great," he said smoothly. "Really. Your wife is a wonderful host." My hands clenched at my sides. My husband grinned. "Told you she was amazing." Richard's gaze flicked to me. And in that instant, I knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because the way he looked at me, with that unreadable, calm, collected smile, told me one thing. He wasn't done playing yet. I forced a nervous laugh, stepping back, trying to keep the situation light. "You should go back to the living room," I said, keeping my voice steady. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached out. A light touch. Barely there. But the weight of it felt like a heavy chain tightening around me. I yanked my arm away, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You should leave," I said. My voice shook slightly, but I didn't care. His smile deepened, slow, calculated. Like he was enjoying this. Enjoying me squirming. Enjoying the game. Because that's what this was to him. A game. He leaned in just slightly. And in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, he said something that made my blood run ice cold. "Your husband doesn't even notice you." His words slithered into my mind like poison. Do you think he'd care? My breath caught in my throat. What was he saying? What was he trying to do? I shook my head. "You don't know anything about my marriage." His smirk deepened. "Don't I?" I clenched my fists. "You're insane." A low chuckle escaped his lips, like my words amused him. "As much as you want to deny it," he murmured, "we both know the truth." My pulse pounded, my vision tunneling. "There is no truth," I snapped. "Just you overstepping boundaries that should never be crossed." I wanted to sound strong, unshaken. But deep down, I knew, he saw right through me, through my fear, through my doubts. And that terrified me more than anything. He took a slow step forward. Then another, closing the distance I had just put between us. I backed up instinctively, until my spine pressed against the counter. No more space. No escape. His eyes locked onto mine, dark, calculating. "I wonder," he murmured, his voice smooth as silk, "what you would do if I pushed just a little further." My body went rigid. "Don't," I warned, my voice barely above a whisper. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering it. Then, without warning, he reached out. I flinched. But he didn't grab me. Didn't force anything. Instead, he ran his fingers along the edge of my sleeve. A barely there touch. Slow. Deliberate. A test. A silent question. Would I stop him? Would I pull away? Or would I hesitate? The second his fingers grazed my skin, I slapped his hand away. "Don't touch me." My voice was stronger than I expected. For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes. Amusement. Satisfaction. Like he had been waiting for me to fight back. Like I had just given him exactly what he wanted. The silence between us thickened. Heavy. Suffocating. My chest rose and fell rapidly, waiting. Waiting for his next move. For the moment this would escalate. Then, he smiled. Not a smirk. Not a mocking grin. Something worse. Something dangerous. A look of amusement. Like he had just confirmed something he already suspected. "You like control, don't you?" he mused. I stilled. What was he talking about? My teeth clenched. "Get out." He chuckled softly. "Or what?" My fingers curled into fists. I wanted to scream. To shove him. To do something, anything, that would force him away. But I knew the truth. If I fought too hard, if I showed too much fear, it would only make things worse. Because this wasn't about force. This was about control. And right now, he still thought he had it. He leaned in just slightly, close enough to make the air between us disappear. "I don't think you'll tell him," he whispered. My stomach twisted. "Because if you did," he continued smoothly, "he might start asking the wrong questions." My blood ran cold. What was he implying? I opened my mouth to speak, to demand an answer. Then it happened. Footsteps. Coming from the hallway. In an instant, Richard stepped back. Too fast. Like he didn't want to get caught standing this close to me. Like, for the first time that night, he was the one who was afraid. The kitchen door swung open, and my husband walked in, completely oblivious. "Hey," he said, glancing between us. "Everything okay?" I stared at Richard. Watching. Waiting. Would he twist the truth? Would he turn this moment against me? Would he laugh it off, make it seem like nothing had happened? Instead, he simply smiled. That same infuriatingly calm smile. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Your wife was just telling me how much she enjoys having company over." My fists clenched, but I said nothing. Because I knew, this wasn't over. Minutes later, Richard grabbed his coat. "I should be heading out," he announced. My husband clapped him on the back. "Great seeing you, man. Let's do this again." Richard's gaze flickered to me. And then, with a calm, unreadable expression, he said, "Oh, don't worry. We will." A shiver ran down my spine. Because I knew he wasn't talking to my husband. He was talking to me. Even after he left, the house felt wrong. Like the walls still carried his presence. Like the air still held on to his breath. I sat on the couch, staring at the front door, my fingers gripping my knees. My husband laughed at something on his phone, completely unaware. Unaware of what had just happened. Unaware of what had nearly happened. And I couldn't breathe. I should tell him. Right now. Before it was too late. Before Richard got another chance. But as I turned toward my husband, I hesitated. I could still see Richard's face. That smirk. That quiet amusement. That warning. If you tell him, he might start asking the wrong questions. Was that a threat? Or a challenge? My throat tightened. What if Richard twisted the story? What if he made me look guilty instead? My husband had been friends with him long before I even knew his name. Would he believe me? Would he even want to? Or would he see this as something else? Something I had invited? A cold realization hit me. If I got this wrong, it wouldn't be Richard who paid the price. It would be me. The minutes dragged. I forced myself to smile. To nod. To pretend. But inside, I was unraveling. I excused myself early, claiming I was tired. My husband kissed my forehead. I barely felt it as I climbed the stairs. Guilt twisted in my stomach. I should have told him. But it was too late now. Richard had won this round. And somehow, I knew. He wasn't done playing. I barely slept. Every sound made my heart race. Every shadow in the hallway looked too tall. Too human. Even with the bedroom door locked, I felt exposed. Vulnerable. I had never hated silence more than I did that night. Then, just past 2 a.m. My phone vibrated. My breath caught. Slowly, I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The screen glowed in the darkness. One new message. Unknown number. But I knew. I knew exactly who it was. And when I read it, my stomach dropped. "You can run, but you can't hide. See you soon." A shiver ran down my spine. I sat up, gripping the sheets, my pulse hammering. This wasn't just a game anymore. This was a hunt. I didn't sleep. I sat awake until the sun broke through the curtains. Every creak of the house made my chest tighten. I needed to do something. To take control. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for him to make his next move. But how? If I told my husband, would he believe me? If I went to the police, would they even care? There was no proof. No video. No physical marks. Just his words. His presence. His quiet, calculated destruction. And now, his promise that this wasn't over. I had to act. Before he did. By morning, I had already made up my mind. Over breakfast, I kept my voice casual. "I'm thinking of visiting my sister for a few days." My husband barely looked up from his coffee. "That's a good idea. You need a break." So casual. Like I was just another wife who needed a little rest. Not someone who was running from a predator. I packed quickly, stuffing essentials into my suitcase. If I could just get away, I could figure out my next move. But just as I zipped up my bag, a knock at the front door. I froze. Ice spread through my veins. From downstairs, my husband called out. "I got it. No. No, no, no." My body moved on autopilot. I rushed to the stairs, reaching the bottom just in time to see my husband swing the door open. And there he was, Richard, standing on my porch, smiling, like he belonged here. My breath caught. What was he doing here? What did he want? I felt sick. My husband clapped him on the back. Didn't expect to see you so soon. What's up? Richard's eyes flickered to mine. Just for a second. But I saw it. That same look. The one that said, I'm in control here. Then, casually, effortlessly, he smiled. I was just in the neighborhood, he said. A lie. Every word out of his mouth was a lie. Thought I'd stop by. His eyes locked on mine. Wanted to say goodbye. My chest tightened. I knew what he was doing. This wasn't a farewell. This was a reminder. No matter where I went, he could always find me. He was letting me go now. But only because he wanted to. Not because I had one. Because he wasn't finished. I forced myself to smile. To act normal. To not let my husband see the fear creeping up my spine. Well, I said, my voice barely steady. Safe travels. Richard held my gaze a moment longer. Then, he nodded. Turned. Walked back to his car. And drove away. I watched the car disappear down the street. I should have felt relieved. But I didn't. Because I knew. This wasn't the end. Not really. I had escaped for now. But Richard wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. One day. Weeks. Months. Years from now. He'd be back. And next time. I might not get away.